Everything that I say won't mean anything less when I'm found in a grave and you put me to rest. Everything that I say won't mean anything less when I'm found in a grave and you put me to rest.
Hi, welcome to Free to Disagree's Communal Sense Podcast. My name is Amanda MacDonald, and today we have with us Treye Connor. He is a psych major here at UCCS, and we're going to talk about the Jungian shadow.
So, where do we begin?
Well, first, it would probably be beneficial to give people like a brief overview of what the shadow actually is and what it means as far as Carl Jung is concerned.
Okay. So, the shadow, according to Jung, is the repressed part of the individual, or as he puts it, the opposite.
If people observe their own unconscious tendencies in other people, this is called a projection. Political agitation in all countries is full of such projections, just as much as the backyard gossip of little groups and individuals. Projections of all kinds obscure our view of our fellow men, spoiling its objectivity, and thus spoiling all possibility of genuine human relationships. And there is an additional disadvantage in projecting our shadow. If we identify our own shadow with, say, the communists or the capitalists, a part of our own personality remains on the opposing side. The result is that we shall constantly, though involuntarily, do things behind our own backs that support this other side, and thus we shall unwittingly help our enemy. If, on the contrary, we realize the projection and can discuss matters without fear or hostility, dealing with the other person sensibly, then there is a chance of mutual understanding, or at least of a truce. Whether the shadow becomes our friend or enemy depends largely upon ourselves. The shadow is not necessarily always an opponent. In fact, he is exactly like any human being with whom one has to get along, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires. The shadow becomes hostile only when he is ignored or misunderstood. Sometimes, though not often, an individual feels impelled to live out the worst side of his nature and to repress his better side. In such cases, the shadow appears as a positive figure in his dreams. But to a person who lives out his natural emotions and feelings, the shadow may appear as a cold and negative intellectual. It then personifies poisonous judgments and negative thoughts that have been held back. So whatever form it takes, the function of the shadow is to represent the opposite side of the ego and to embody just those qualities that one dislikes most in other people.
So whenever we're growing up, we get told there's certain ways to be and things to do that we're not supposed to do. So for example, I'm growing up and I hit my brother, and my mom says, "That's bad, don't hit." And so I say to myself, well, I can't hit. That's a piece of me that I can't express. And if I express it, it's going to have dire consequences because I'm relying on my mother for my well-being. I am solely dependent on her, and without her, I die. So it's very crucial to myself that I never, ever, ever express that part of myself, because if I express that part of myself, it's going to be very bad. So that violent piece of me doesn't just go away, and in fact, it existed there first to begin with, and it wouldn't be repressed if it didn't exist in the first place. So I take that violent piece of myself and I simply repress it, and I cut it off, and I say, no, that can never come out. Well, we're that way with a lot of things. So if I value logic and thinking, a lot of times people are going to repress the feeling part of themselves. So you'll see this with kids that grow up and it's like they cry, and so their parents say, "Why are you crying? That's weak. I'm going to give you something to really cry about." So they suppress their feeling side and they grow up and they're cold and logical, which isn't inherently unhealthy, but I'm saying that there's a piece of them that they had to repress, and so it's hidden away from themselves.
Right.
And so now that piece doesn't just go away. And in fact, I think we can all agree that it's a part of them because it was there to begin with, and then it becomes repressed. So later on in life, whenever they see someone crying, you can see this with kids too. So like back to whenever they hit one another, you can see it. Kids will actually act it out right away because when they're young, they see their friends hitting one of their friends, and they essentially repeat what their parents told them. And they say, "No, don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. I'm going to tell on you, showing that they are, again, acting out that piece of yourself is bad.
Right.
Repress it, get rid of it. And whenever they see it in kids outside of themselves, it's like, hey, I know that behavior. That's bad. Don't do that. And they attack the piece that they've once suppressed themselves. So back to the emotional thing, people grow up and it's kind of the same thing. You'll see adults, whenever people are real emotional, they'll go up and be like, oh, why are you such a sissy? Stop crying. And they're just essentially reacting out something that they learned when they're young. And they're attacking what it is not attacking the other person, but they're attacking as a piece of themselves. It's a learned piece of behavior. Whenever there's this that's being expressed, it needs to be repressed and put away. So whenever they see it, they attack it. And you see this a lot in like gay people. It was kind of like a joke early 2000s when it was really becoming an issue. But like the typical like gay man that hates gays and attacks gays all over the place, and then in the end you find out he's gay. Right. It's like, why is he attacking it so much? Well, it's issues he's dealing with himself. He has a repressed side and he attacks it in himself. So whenever he sees it outside himself, he attacks it there too.
So it can be not just negative emotions like the expression of violence or anger. It can be literally any emotion that you deem at one point or another in your life as one that you don't want to have.
100%. It could be anything. A lot of people repress positive things too. Like I was saying with the emotional thing, like some kids will express love and they'll get punished for that. And so they grow up cold and hard. Like, I'm in the streets. I was raised in the streets. Don't express love. You know what I'm saying? And they repress that too.
So then what's the utility of the shadow and recognizing the shadow then? Because the way that I understood it, it was basically like if you can recognize the repressed parts of yourself and other people, it causes some kind of negative reaction within yourself in which you dislike that individual, or you dislike that person or behavior, because you just believe inherently throughout experience that you shouldn't have that. And by you, I mean like the general you, whether it's you personally or the other person that you're seeing them things in.
Well, one of the utilities of it is whenever you realize that those are all parts of yourself, you expand who you are as a self. So you're essentially cut off from expressing and experiencing large amounts of yourself. So a huge majority of who you are is cut off and shoved down into the unconscious and never to be recognized. So that's one benefit. And a second benefit would also be you're not so bitter and hostile towards people who express the things that you have suppressed.
Okay, so if, for example, I'm a pretty disagreeable person generally, so if I see somebody who is overly agreeable for whatever reason, I look at that person, I say that person's weak, right? But there are parts of myself that are probably agreeable in one scenario or another, in which it would be beneficial for me to harness that agreeableness as opposed to disagreeableness in order to have a full view of what myself actually looks like.
100%.
Right.
And it's also, it's good to utilize, like you'll have more tools in your toolbox. So you can be disagreeable when you need to be disagreeable, but whenever you unlock that side of yourself, you'll also be able to be agreeable when you need to be agreeable, instead of always stuck in disagreeableness. And anytime you need to be agreeable, when it would be advantageous to be agreeable, instead of saying, no, I don't want to do that because I'd be a pussy. Well, now you have another tool in your toolbox. You're more able to adapt. You're able to overcome. You're stronger. You have more tools.
Right. Didn't you call that like some kind of like self-enlightenment, in which you can have a full view of yourself and use each of those pieces of yourself as you should use them? But the shadow recognition or non-recognition, I guess, of the shadow kind of causes like a hateful, or like a, maybe not hateful, but like a negative, it applies a negative connotation to whatever that is and whatever that person is. And I was listening to a couple of podcasts about not just the shadow, but Jordan Peterson talks about the shadow all the time. And there's always that old adage where, you know, you can point out the splinter in someone else's eye, but not the log that's in your own. And it's kind of the idea that, you know, I would find myself hating on somebody that maybe doesn't really need to be hated on, but really needs to be admired in some way or another, because they may have a better tact of life that I haven't been tapping into to make myself a better individual.
Yeah, definitely. It's always good to broaden your horizons with yourself and become stronger and just have more options available to you. So that's one utility of it. So it's not just like you're saying, not being bitter, but it's, if you want to get something out of it, it's not just doing good for the world and being less bitter towards other people. It's quite literally making yourself stronger. So.
Right. And then I think about this, and then I apply it culturally to politics a lot. And this is where I end up getting into a lot of trouble when I'm talking about this stuff, because I find often that, for example, any one ideological possession, whether it be some kind of communism or some kind of overly capitalist or overly individualistic conception of the world, it puts you in a position in which you can't move beyond that, and you find yourself having to, you apply this negative shadow notion to the outside world, and you project that onto the outside world, and you end up having some ideological possession that makes you want to really kind of dismantle whatever ideological possession that is, or whatever characteristic it is that allows that ideological possession to actually express itself in the real. Does that make sense?
Expand more on expressing itself in the real. What do you mean by that?
Like in the body politic, for example, like Malcolm X used to talk a lot about how black communities needed to get together with themselves and fully invest and fully develop their own communities in order to kind of compete with white communities. But you find in contemporary America that it's not, that the focus of movements like BLM are not necessarily to inherently make the black community better as much as it is to stifle other communities.
Right, combat the other ones.
Right,
yeah.
Whether it be a policing community or something like that, and it causes like a hatred toward the policing community instead of a self-reflection of, okay, maybe we could make our communities better. And this is the same too with like a redneck community in Kentucky, or
100%.
with, you know, a white supremacist community that hates on black people. And I see the ideological possession that it expresses itself in the body politic, and I wonder how it is that you can combat that other than by saying, hey, you're expressing the Jungian shadow. You know?
Yeah, you're attacking something that you've just repressed yourself.
Right, attacking something that you may actually value if you allowed yourself to reflect on it long enough.
I read this interesting study the other day that is totally applicable to that. So you're talking about groups. It's like the more that they're trying to build themselves up, it's like simultaneously they attack all the others at the same time. So it's like you're saying with the like white supremacists and stuff, and it's like, yeah, I get that you're just loving your own people and trying to protect yourself, but that doesn't mean that you need to damn everyone else in the process.
Right.
And it goes back to like what you're saying, like Black Lives Matter, and it's like, I get you're trying to help out your community, but at the same time you're kind of damning all the other ones that aren't you. So I read this interesting study, and it was about oxytocin, which is the love hormone or the love chemical. So in animals, whenever they cuddle and snuggle and bond with their own, they release oxytocin. And humans do the same thing. So whenever humans cuddle, they release oxytocin. Whenever you spend your time with your partner, you release oxytocin. Whenever you spend time with your kids, you release oxytocin. And dogs actually do this too. So whenever you look your dog, not anyone else's dog, it'll probably cause them to get aggressive. But your own dog, whenever you look your own dog in the eyes for an extended period of time, the dog will actually release oxytocin because he's in love with his owner. And we do this too. So what they did was they brought these people in a lab, and they had a spray bottle, and they sprayed oxytocin up people's noses. And then they had them do these games, these studies. And one of the studies was, so you have a situation, and there's a train coming down the tracks, and it's going to run over 4 people, or you can pull the lever, and it's going to veer off and run over 1. So if you don't touch it, and you have nothing to do with it, it's going to kill 4 people. But if you choose to pull the lever by your own action, it's going to kill 1. And what they did was they sprayed people with oxytocin, and they had them answer the question. But what was interesting is whenever they were telling them that the one, that if they pull the lever and he gets run over, had a foreign name, they were more likely to pull the lever to kill the 1 to save the 4 if he had a foreign name when they were sprayed with oxytocin.
Does that apply across countries, do you know?
Mm-hmm. They tested a whole bunch of different people for this.
So if I was like in Asia and they had
right.
an American
and you had a white
they'd
name,
still be more likely to
right.
pull the...
Correct.
Okay.
Now this is interesting because what this shows us is so whenever you have a lot of love for one group, it typically is actually followed by a lot of fear and protection and anger towards the out group. And what they called this is the in-group, out-group bias. So whenever you spray people with oxytocin, they're more loving, empathetic, caring, cuddling. And what this does is they're more caring, empathetic, and cuddling towards their own and less towards others or people of the outgroup. And this makes sense because if you look at a mother and her children, of course she's more caring to her own children
right.
and more protective and defensive against the outgroup or strangers. And the same thing is with fathers. Fathers release oxytocin when they're with their children because it's the love hormone. They love their children, they love their families, and this makes them protective of their families, which is good because you need to be protective. Like, this is the real world. So it's good that they love their family and they're protective of their family. But when you look at politics, it's kind of the same thing. There's a huge in-group, out-group bias. And you see this especially apparent with the left nowadays, where we, like, a lot of people call them the bleeding heart left. And it's like, I understand that you are very loving of your people, and this makes them very defensive of out-groups or
right.
people that are not like them. So love isn't always like the answer. It just really depends on who you put in the in-group and the out-group. I guess the question is, who is it you choose to love? So,
yeah, that's pretty interesting. I always, whenever I'm talking about like the left and right dichotomy, I find myself making this weird analogy in which the ideological possession that allows for the government to have some overbearing role in your life that says, hey, we love you and we want to give you this. A contemporary example of this would be like healthcare for all or public schools or the idea of whether or not we're going to give reparations to people. And I find that what ends up happening is that the ideological possession that is more interested in giving you things is the ideological possession that is much like an overbearingly loving mother. And if you can think about getting a hug from your mom, you get that first hug from your mom and you hold it for about 10 seconds and you're like, oh, this is really great. And you get that chemical that releases that you were just talking about. And then mom doesn't want to let you go, you know. So then she kind of starts jerking you around a little bit and squeezing you a little bit tighter, giving you like a bear hug. And then pretty soon mom is bear hugging you so hard that you can no longer breathe and that your ribs are cracking. And now, and now you're in trouble and you might actually have to die. So I find it interesting that where the individual is allowed to express themselves in a way that allows them to express their industriousness on their own and in their own terms. It actually allows them for more freedom than it would if mom just gave you everything that you wanted. It's kind of like in Harry Potter when you have Dewey, the original child, between the parents or whatever, who's very spoiled. Last year I got 37 presents, you know. And it doesn't matter how big the present is, it's the number of the presents that you get.
Yeah.
So, and then Harry Potter is kind of like stuck with nothing, and he's kind of like the rule breaker and whatever. And I find that really interesting because the kid who is the most dangerous between them is actually the child that got almost everything. And that used to be 100%. Self-evident to people. And it doesn't seem like that's self-evident anymore, at least not culturally. It's like we forget when we start to analyze the collective that the collective is actually made up of a sum of individuals first before it becomes a collective. And you can't have a collective without the individual. And Ray and I talk about this all the time, in which the individual, if ruling over a collective, the collective can still exist. But if the collective is ruling, the individual is repressed almost completely. And if you're not part of this in-group, then you are part of the out-group and therefore an enemy of the collective. And I feel like that is... that's like a sociological expression of that same shadow that Jungian is talking about. If the collective would analyze itself and realize that it's a sum of parts of an individual that are as different as can be on the individual level. Like you and I are nothing the same, you know, or Ray and I are nothing the same. We may have similar ideas, but when push comes to shove, we're all inherently different people, but we make up a collective of society, you know?
I think that transitions perfectly back into our discussion on the shadow. The collective, I think, currently is split. Like if you look in the United States, it's common discussion that people have become polarized and split. And I don't think this is on the level of the collective. I don't think it's groups of people that are split. I think it's individuals are split. So back to our discussion on the shadow, we're not talking about groups here that are split. We're talking about individuals here that are split. There's people that aren't willing to recognize the liberal in themselves or the conservative in themselves. And you can easily identify this whenever you talk to an individual. And you're not talking to a group. So if you talk to someone and you say, what do you think about liberals? They hate liberals. They hate them. And that to me is a split on the level of the individual. It's not the culture. It's not the collective that's been split. It's the individual.
Right,
and
like
the
that individual person you're talking to.
Exactly. And the collective is simply a reflection of what's happening on the individual level. Like you're saying, the collective consists of individuals. Well, if we trace it back down to the level of the individual, it's the individual that's split. It's not the collective that's split.
Right, it's the individual that's not recognizing the things in themselves that they don't like. The individual not reconciling
100%.
those differences.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think it also ties in with, like you were mentioning earlier, ideological possession. Once people become possessed by an ideology, the other ideologies or other parts of themselves are instantly shut down and turned off and tucked away. And they hate those pieces. I was having a discussion with one of my friends. I showed you the discussion.
Oh, yeah,
but he was talking about how he would do anything for, he's part of the left, he would do anything for the leftist ideology. And whenever he talked about right-wing or conservative ideologies, he claimed that they were a sickness in himself. And so when he talked about conservative ideologies, that's literally it. He claimed they were a sickness. He said, I recognized I had a sickness within myself, and he tried as hard as he could to get rid of it, but things don't just go away. You don't just push it down and it doesn't just go away. It gets stored up and it becomes that's when it becomes a sickness in you. So it's perfectly evidently clear that it's the individual that has become split, especially in his example. He claimed that being on the right was a sickness, and so he pushed it away and hid it in himself. And it's that way with many people. They attribute commonly like being conservative with being hateful. So you see that one quite a bit, like, oh, you're hateful or you're racist. And if they were to ever accept a little bit of a conservative side on themselves, they would have to accept things that they attribute to the conservative side, which is being racist and hateful and xenophobic. and a lot of negative things. So it's no wonder that they push it away and say, no, it doesn't exist. It just
like
doesn't
this
exist.
doesn't apply to me.
Mm-hmm.
I could never be
Mm-hmm.
a prison guard at the Gulag.
Mm-hmm.
I could never
Mm-hmm.
be a prison guard
Mm-hmm.
in Auschwitz, kind of stuff like that. Jordan Peterson talks about that all the
Mm-hmm.
time too.
Exactly.
And I think that's super interesting too, because it's not that, like, when you repress things, it's not that they repress and go away, like you were saying. It's that they repress and they actually become bigger. They become stronger problems, and they express
100%.
themselves in more insidious ways than they otherwise would if you just confront them.
It's like a pressure cooker.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like steam building up. You know, I read something very interesting one time about the Catholic Church. So apparently the Catholic Church has a pedophile problem. Now, I'm not going to say I believe that or not. I'll leave that to everyone else.
Yeah, I feel
But
like it's pretty
just
definitive at this point.
Just for the sake of the article, it was talking about, well, why is this? And it was talking about what happens when you repress things, and eventually it builds up and it explodes and it spills out in very negative and just terrible ways. Well, the Catholic Church is very big on abstinence and not being sexual. Monks, they can't have sex, period. So these religious people, they repress their sexual side, and sooner or later that pressure cooker blows up and it spills out. And back to the conversation with the guy that was repressing his conservative side, or whatever he attributes to being conservative. It's not necessarily the ideology that he might be repressing, but it might be the attributes that he attributes to being conservative. So like I said, hateful or xenophobic or whatever.
Right. It doesn't seem to me that he's willfully blind, though,
right.
which is...
He knows that he has issues with that, and that's why he shoves it down. But in that same conversation, he was talking about, you know, he was talking about how he represses that, and in the same conversation, same paragraph, he talked about how he went down rabbit holes of white nationalism. So he talked about how he fell in a rabbit hole of white nationalist rhetoric. And that's pretty extreme, because I've never gone
white
down.
White nationalism is pretty extreme. You can't just fall into white nationalism. It doesn't work
just
like that.
Just like pedophilia is.
Right.
And just let that be a lesson of what happens when you repress things. Eventually it's going to go boom, and it's going to be way worse than if you just accept it. So I would just look at what angers you and others. That's what Jung said was the doorway to the self is: look around you, look what pisses you off, look what angers you about others, and realize that there's a reason you're getting mad about those things, and it's not them. So,
right, it's not them, it's you. It's the parts about you that you've chosen to forget or have,
repressed.
Right.
Yeah. So, but that's my whole idea is the split in politics and the split on the collective level. It doesn't need to be addressed on a collective level. We don't need to get together and form groups. It needs to be addressed on the individual level. If you get rid of the split on the individual level, the collective level will no longer be split, because the collective is built up of individuals.
Right, exactly.
And ultimately, if individuals can not be so split themselves, we wouldn't have this issue. So.
Heard that. All right.
I think that about sums it up.
Well, my man, it was awesome having you over and talking about it. I
Thanks.
really appreciate it.
First podcasting with you guys. I appreciate it. Enjoyed it. It's pretty fun. We'll have to do another one for sure.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Maybe on what your plans are and your thoughts on insurance and everything. We can do that sometime.
Ooh.
Ooh. All right. Good talking to you, Trey.
Oh!